So thank you, everyone. In the startup community, there's something called the reverse pitch, where big companies get up in front of entrepreneurs and say, this would be cool if you guys would work on something and solve a problem for us. I kind of think of this panel as a reverse pitch for you all to go work on. And so I think I'll just throw out a question for the group, and let's talk to each other too. The rules of improv, yes and build on what somebody might say, Second City rules. But a question for the group, what stands out as something important that you might have heard today or in this conference, particularly important?
Okay, I'll start. I think this notion of inequality hurts growth is something that really sticks with me, having been just highlighted again this morning. To the extent that I'm working with low-income single moms and their kids, it's always about this question of, if not me, who, in terms of helping that particular population find not only their own ability to contribute to the economy, but to break that cycle of poverty for that next generation. And so that, to me, is an important problem to sit with.
Commissioner?
Yeah, let me follow up with that. I think that one of the things I was concerned about, this conference actually stressed me out quite a bit. And part of it was I was taking on some of your stress, Neil. You don't need me to help you with your stress, but I feel the stress about what are you going to do now that you have all this information. But part of what I was worried about was here's the Fed driving down this road with full employment on the one side or maximum employment on the one side and price stability on the other side. Then all these drags we started hearing about, poverty, long-term poverty, and income inequality. And so it really became clear to me that these headwinds or tail draggers are really difficult concepts to figure out. How can the Fed do its job with its two primary goals and yet deal with some of these long-term structural issues that just won't go away, whether it's poverty or income inequality. So like you, Gloria, I thought this is really an important area that I think we need to really think about, and I think the Fed rightfully is listening to and thinking about how do we address these issues as well as the other, because there are such fundamental consequences to some of the ideas that I've learned about in terms of the inflation adjustments and volatility and income levels. And so I think there's just a lot we can think about of what's going to happen. Go ahead.
I found out that I represent the other when I looked at the chart that Bill showed, and it had the white folks and the black folks and the Asian folks and the Latino folks, and then there was other. And that's what I represent, which is the American Indians in this country, both on the reservation and in the urban area. And with the other comes other issues. And some of the things that I heard today that seem to be outliers for many of the other populations are the major sources of income. When I look at the unemployment rate in Minnesota as being less than 4%, but in the American Indian community, it's over 13%. When I look at the number of Native Americans or American Indians that are not in the workforce, that number is closer to 40%. And so there are a lot of things in the other category that really creates a lot of strife.
I think one of the things that I was struck by is, how interrelated the issues are. And so while for too many of our conversations, and I think a couple of the economists yesterday noted kind of what's in the headlines versus what is actually underneath when we begin to look at the data, we can tend to find the othering that tends to occur, whether we're talking about othering based on race or othering based on income, othering based on firms versus people. But at the end of the day, inequality versus whether or not a company or a firm is profitable, inequality versus wealth begins to impact us all. And when we begin to talk in some of the conversations this morning about the social constructs or welfare, the supports that we believe are set up to be able to help people, but ultimately are not helping too many of us all at all, And when we begin to see economic shocks take place, whether or not those welfare supports, those economic supports that we've put in place as a country are actually helping those that we think they're helping in the headlines, we see that the conversations, the data that we've lifted up over the last 2 days ultimately tell us that we need to have many more conversations, many more strategies, many more policies that are designed to be able to connect firms, to be able to connect those who are wealthy with those who are suffering at the lowest ends of our economic spectrums and those that are in the middle, all at the same time, if we truly want our economy to move forward. And it was heartening to see that conversation today, and yet disheartening to not see it called out more explicitly.
I actually went home last night after the dinner saying, I have no idea. I talked to Ron, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to say to this group. And on TV when I got home, my husband was watching Harry Potter, and I was like, that's what the experience was like. I'm coming from this muggle world of, fiscal stuff into the wizarding world here at the Federal Reserve on the monetary side. And obviously the worlds interact with each other, but it's sometimes difficult to cross that boundary. I think I'll pick up what I heard that I really resonated with. Dr. Spriggs, I believe, talked about the barriers to full participation are real and numerous, and now at a time of quote-unquote full employment is the opportunity to address them. Because I think in the world we're all in, there are enormous barriers around care for children, care for elderly. We were talking about last mile transit. There are numerous barriers to quote-unquote full employment that are very real in the populations we serve. And at a time now, whether or not we're headed downward with some of the trends concerns us, but we're overall in a time of general, positive, near full employment. That's the time to start to address these because they're very real and have very real impacts.
Thank you. So one of the ideas behind this whole conference is about the business cycle, the ups and downs of the economy, broader economy. In thinking about the communities that you all serve, who do you see left behind as the economy goes up and the economy goes down, or maybe permanently left behind? Who are you thinking about when you think about that?
I will just give an example of something you already know. At the Wilder Foundation, one of our service areas is in the Promise Neighborhood Schools program. And this is an area that was devastated by the government deciding to put Highway 94 through the neighborhood largely because it was an African-American community. So all of that wealth disappeared with that federal action. That area was enormously hit in the turn down in 2008. One of the consequences of that is nervousness about credit, nervousness about banks, nervousness about any financial institution because of what happened to them 11 years ago, or longer when it began. So I think one of the consequences, even though we've come out of that, is enormous hesitancy about participating in that market, even if they are financially able. And that's inhibiting wealth creation, it's inhibiting job creation. That nervousness is real and justified given how the community was treated by financial institutions.
Gloria, thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree that when I think about who's being left behind, I think about the population that we're serving, which is predominantly women of color. Within that, certainly immigrant communities, and I don't think we talked much about that last couple of days, but the notion of like the gig economy and entrepreneurship, I think are opportunities that could be researched to see how investments in alternative work opportunities could help our families. But I would say in today's economy, the single mom who is trying to pursue an education amidst all the barriers is definitely hurting.
I would say the children. It comes down to families in my life, in the people I serve, and where I see the most devastation is in the children.
I'm going to take kind of a practical bit, because when I listened to your great papers, and I got all the equations, by the way, pretty much. When I listened to your papers and your issues, I keep trying to think about how, as a fiscal policy advisor for the governor and the legislature, what can we do to lessen the people who are left behind? What kind of programs can we design? And I actually came away even more concerned that some of the state programs we designed for these economic downturns really have such frequent qualification issues that the churn that happens with people getting on and off these programs causes an enormous amount of instability. And just when they need that extra month or so of help, it just disappears because they're no longer qualified because they're employed or they have a minimal amount of employment. So I'm trying to figure out ways that we can design programs to make these links, like from the earned income tax credit that we talked about earlier. I think Susan talked about that. There are just some things we need to design better. And so I'm worried about how can we design things that eliminate some of the people or reduce the number of people left behind.
I would echo all of the answers that have been given here. I want to add to it, though, that we're ultimately leaving everyone in our economy behind. For every day that we leave low-income mothers behind, communities of color behind, indigenous communities behind, immigrant communities behind, we are leaving dollars on the table. Productivity ceases. It continues to decline. Spending declines because people don't have it. We heard the presentations earlier about people relying on credit, people continuing to borrow dollars that they cannot afford, people living in poverty, people operating who you gave the gap in your community about people who are out of the labor market and yet the people who are just completely unemployed. We're leaving our entire economy behind and yet continuing to not value that, as was shared in the presentation by Josh yesterday, and not continuing to elevate the impact that people of color, all of these communities could have on our economy, and instead looking at it through a continued moral cause, a continued charity cause, and just the social cause of what the social impact of what it causes when we don't have those folks working in our economy.
Thank you. So what did you hear at the conference that might be, particularly well suited, or as a policy idea, or as even as a research topic for the kind of communities that we've just talked about? Maybe the communities that you're most closely work with. There wasn't a single good idea in 2 days. Yeah.
I'll take the bait. I mean, that's part of the translation problem that I spoke to at the Harry Potter reference. I think I'm guessing that all of us really resonated with Dr. Sprague's presentation, because we see on a daily basis the impact of that work, and he's studying it sort of at a macro level and academically. I don't think that's still yet. I didn't hear much that was, and it wasn't intended to say, okay, here's how we address it. Certainly the availability of credit for these communities, things like that at the monetary side, I think are important, but I didn't hear a lot.
I will mention the issue that Susan raised about contract workers and employees. One of the difficulties we have in this current job situation, and so as a chief labor negotiator for 35,000 employees, one of the things we have a hard time doing is we're starting to see more and more need for contract workers or isolated jobs so that we have the flexibility for them to come and go. But I know other employers are seeing that too. But we really need to have a better handle on what workers, whether you're an independent contractor or an employee, what workers have access to health care. How can we provide that health care? Because if we don't design a health care system to let those people participate in, it's going to be a problem. And the other thing is housing. One of the things I think we need to do more of is figure out how do we make housing that's affordable available to I see that as sort of the key to a lot of different areas, whether it's education or in worker classification. People need to have access to housing, and that's sort of, if you don't have that, that's one of those things you go down this really bad slope if you don't have that.
I think the very nature of your question causes me to think about how can the Federal Reserve continue to not only listen to us who work with communities who are impacted, but like literally listen to the people that we're serving, right? And it goes back to what was said about the nature of the question. What are those questions that are really relevant for the people for whom we're trying to help? And that, I think, for me is what I'm trying to articulate or translate in my own head about everything that I heard over the last couple of days. But what are those key levers? I know there's not a magic bullet, but what are the key levers that are impacting access, that are smoothing the instability because of the change of the business cycle? What are the barriers for the investment in human capital that people are investing in themselves or in future generations? Those are some of the questions that I grapple with, and I'm hoping that the Institute could certainly think about, because you have a lot of intellectual capital here.
Follow on?
Well,
go
yeah,
ahead.
one of the things that I heard today was the shock from the recession. People of extremely low poverty didn't see a shock. There was no shock. You know, when I look at the number of folks in my community that lost their house because they couldn't make their mortgage payment, they don't have a mortgage payment. And so they didn't lose it. You know, they didn't, there was just no, there was no blip that I saw in the shock of the recession with the extremely low income folks. And that was, that's kind of interesting.
I think I've heard President Kashkari speak a lot and write a lot about wages and where wages are. And I think we continue to see, even in our own market here in Minnesota, we see the employment gaps continuing to close, but we see the wage gaps continuing to persist and grow. And to the point that was raised on the last panel about the continued gap for black and white unemployment and wages, we've had our studies done in Minnesota that I think continue to be the same across the country that show that even when we norm for education and training for African Americans, the gaps persist, as was stated on the panel. I wanted to stand up and cheer. Thank you so much for pointing that out, that we can't continue to solve for that problem at all and haven't solved for it yet by training alone. And so to the extent that we can use policy and use data to continue to inform employers, not just to hire, but to hire around just jobs. This information, that the influence that you used, Myron, around housing, but to think about housing and other benefits, the influence around insurance. How do we think not only about insurance, but other benefits and ways that employers can think about having not just a job that pays minimum wage, but a job that allows employees to thrive. And not just thinking about jobs at McDonald's. I think in our region and state particular, and every place that I travel, we hear those terms and we think about the jobs that are at the lowest end of the economic spectrum in terms of the surface level and the view of it. But really, there are jobs that people are doing out there today in manufacturing, and not just those that are low skills. There are mid-skill and high-skill jobs that I see every day with employers who are still paying $11 and $12 an hour for people to get up every day and ride a bus for an hour to make $11 and $12, and then we're saying maybe they don't have the skills to manage those dollars and take care of their families. There are policies we can help put in place and influence employers to do better by their employees, not for the sake of morals, but for the sake of our economy.
You know, I deal with racial inequality in my workplace. I have 90 employees. I'm already over the $15 minimum wage, you know, because I know that if I give my employees money, it stimulates the economy. They're not saving it. They're you know, unfortunately, some of them should save $1.98, but a lot of them are, you know, it's just making their quality of life better. And so I have a workforce that's 73% people of color, you know, and so I practice that in my life every day to make, you know, a little help.
Are there questions that felt omitted in the last couple of days that you wish had been addressed? We've kind of touched on that, but are there other questions that you wish would have been addressed?
Yeah, yesterday, when we were talking about the fact that the volatility of income was going down and the volatility of unemployment was lessening, I was surprised by that. And so what I'd like to see sort of studied is more, does that mean that the current situation with the amount of income inequality that we have and the amount of poverty that we have, are they getting baked into a very stabilized system that we can't change anything on the lower end or on the upper end? So I'm worried that the fact that the lack of volatility in those areas made me think that maybe we've got these things kind of baked in. So I'd like to see more research about how do we affect income inequality and poverty given that things are that stable.
One area that I didn't hear, and it might have been that I missed it, but that I think is really important is the impact of demographics on everything that we're talking about and the coming demographic trends in the next 10 years. So as I understand it, half of baby boomers have no net savings. So when you think about their expectations in the future in terms of interest rates, in terms of the costs that they're going to impose on the public sector for health and long-term care, if you think about the impact that baby boomers leaving the workforce has on the current labor force, which is potentially positive, if you think about the increasing diversity of the workforce, especially in Minnesota, and we're not doing well in those accounts, what I think is important, and again, if I missed it, I apologize, all of the dynamics we're talking about get more complex and in some ways worse because of these demographic trends that are hitting us. And I can say, not because of Myron or for Myron, the public side of it is not ready for this, period. There is not enough tax revenue to solve the long-term care crisis that's coming at us if half of baby boomers have no net savings. And so now there are opportunities in that only accelerates. So if we think we have a child care crisis right now, and we do in Minnesota, we're going to have an elder care crisis because people won't be able to, they're going to want to be in the labor force, but need to take care of adults that they cannot afford to put in an institution. So I think this dynamic impacts everything, especially over the next 10 years, and it's got to be worked into every single conversation. It, just like inequality, it's, it feeds, the two of those feed into each other.
Thank you. So now we're sort of at the phase where we get to put together a wish list. So why don't we think of it that way? We've talked about a little bit that. What would you hope to hear from the Fed and its research capabilities in the near future?
I'll go. Access to capital is still an issue within the minority, the populations, and it's getting tougher and tougher instead of getting easier. But yet there seems to be a lack of interest there, especially in areas with extreme poverty. My feeling is when you have areas of extreme poverty, you need areas of extreme opportunities. And so I'm not seeing that, and I'm involved with a lot of organizations in the process now of creating I'm working with an CDFI, emerging CDFI, to create, another avenue of resource. When I talk about the Native American population, we don't have a lot of credit, and so and so that is almost as bad as not of having bad credit if you don't have any credit, and so really when you talk about entrepreneur folks, and I think that's the reason why we're not seeing as many small business startups, because the ones that I have been part of are usually undercapitalized, which is a recipe for disaster, and then if they get into a position where they need to help themselves, the resources aren't there. The access to capital is very limited.
Other thoughts?
I would second the CDFI point, enormously important. I'm also on the board of an organization in the Twin Cities called Propel Nonprofits, and that CDFIs create all sorts of opportunities. I think, to go back to echo a point I made earlier, to, in your work, highlight the importance of these small barriers to labor force participation that have big impacts on people's lives. I think to be a voice and a reminder for that is really important, because at the margins, the availability of the last half mile to get to health care, to get your child to child care really matters. And while the GDP, impact of that may not be huge, the public cost of not doing it is huge. So it's not necessarily something that you can control on the sort of fiscal side, but I think to be a reminder to our side of the world how important those barriers are, those very real barriers are to labor force participation, including just flat out discrimination.
To the notion that we saw and highlighted yesterday of mobility and the challenges that we face in this decade of not really being able to see children do better than their parents in any form, whether that's education or economics. It'd be interesting to see, given the Fed's local both focus and results on low or early childhood education, some research and attention on multi-generational mobility. How do we begin to solve for not only the needs of parents, but also the needs of children at the same time? How do we move adults into living wage, thriving pathways, not only toward income and jobs, but toward wealth at the same time that we move children onto pathways that allow them to begin to move down a pathway that allows them to do better than their parents. Not only stating the obvious, what we know is that children aren't doing better than their parents, but really what does it take to be able to do that? And then connecting that to firms. What does it take to begin to move incentives? What does it take to be able to move investments, to incentivize firms, to be able to incentivize the public sector, to be able to incentivize philanthropy, to invest in very drastically different ways than we're doing today to move those streams of capital? Because I'm convinced that it isn't just more grant dollars that would flow into CDFIs at incrementally greater rates than what you get today in newer streams. It isn't just incrementally more dollars flowing to minority-owned and indigenous and immigrant-owned businesses in different ways than we're doing today, or a greater number of vouchers going to those families. It's got to be something drastically different than we're doing today, and it's going to take an economic incentive to get all sectors doing that.
I would say highlighting some of the best practices that are happening in our communities or around the country would be great. I thought Susan's example this morning about the hospital in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You know, I'd like to know more about that, and how can we hold that up to the community and say this is a great investment where we will all win if we can invest in these kinds of strategies. I think would be good. I think you have the bully pulpit in a way to be able to say that, and should.
I was really intrigued by the study talking about how when you do stimulus is really important, the value and the big bang you get for the stimulus, whether it's early on or later on, coupled with the study showing that people who enter the job market at the wrong time, the downturn, the long-term effects. I thought I was just blown away by how, if I had the choice to make a decision, I would tend to want to go earlier with stimulus simply because of that, if for no other reason, that there are long-term consequences to waiting, quote, for the right time to do a stimulus package. So I'd like to see a little bit more research in that area, connecting those two issues together, because I think timing is really critical, and that's really hard to convince the public sometimes to get out of the gate right away when the downturn's happening, to do that stimulus right away instead of waiting.
Okay, so maybe it's now time for the audience to ask questions of our panel. We've assembled an all-star team, and so, and notwithstanding all the implied criticism of your work you've heard so far, you know, we are really interested in what you all think, and thank you. So questions, Neil?
Thank you, panelists, for your comments and for being with us the last couple of days, and for all your support of the Institute. We really appreciate it. I've got one comment and one question. My one comment is, when I think about the work that your institutions do, one of the challenges that I observe is it's very hard to scale. How do you get the resources to scale? How do you get the people to scale? That's one advantage we have. We operate, for better or worse, at massive scale. When you think about monetary policy, it affects the entire nation. But that means we can't experiment. Because if we make a mistake, it affects the entire nation. And so that's why these deliberations are so important as we think about the future of monetary policy for the U.S. So I just want to just thank you again for being here. A question I have for you is one comment that came up a lot over the last couple of days. It's the notion of maximum employment. I mean, it's core to our assessment of the economy. And what does maximum employment mean? To me, it means everybody who wants to work has a job and is gainfully employed as much as they would like to be. And if we were to try to push the economy beyond it, the economy wouldn't go any faster, it would just overheat. Think about like the red line in your car. At some point, if you hit the gas hard enough, you don't go any faster, you just damage your engine. So my question for each of you, we can just go down the line, is do you think we're at maximum employment today?
Absolutely not. You know, I think there's still too many folks that are not in the workforce actively seeking employment, and we're not reaching them. We're ignoring them at this point in time. I don't know of any policy or product that is going after in trying to bring those folks into the workforce. And so,
So let me just respond, sorry, just very quickly. One thing that I've observed over the past couple of years is as the economy has gotten stronger and the job market has gotten tighter, you're seeing businesses do things they wouldn't have done a few years earlier because they have to find workers. And that's the example of monetary policy working at scale, meaning businesses, they're not doing it out of charity. They're doing it because it's for their own bottom line. But whatever's causing them to do it, hallelujah that they're doing it. And so anyway, I appreciate your comment, Mike.
I'll repeat myself a little bit, but I think absolutely not from the standpoint of, if you look at the number of people, the number of families with kids in greater Minnesota, where one of them is choosing to stay home because they can't drive the hour and a half to adequate childcare. I mean, the number of people who have to take a job near their house because there's not last mile transit that covers childcare and employment, that's what concerns me. That may not change the unemployment rate drastically, but I think the number of people who are in the labor force but not achieving their potential, either because of discrimination or because of these other barriers, is significant.
So I would echo the absolutely not. I would also say, and I think Josh acknowledged this yesterday, that employers, that's the institution, right, are making the choice to say that the tighter the market becomes, employers have discrimination goes down, right, as a structural construct. At the same time, individual bias does not move at the same rate. And so while individual institutions might say we're going to have fewer policies within our job descriptions, so we might move from saying we require a bachelor's degree to now saying we require a high school diploma, move from a high school diploma to saying no, we don't. It's a GED or not even that. At the same time, individual bias is still at play. I still look at you and say, you're not so much like me, or I hire you and then I move you back out of the workforce, and so that retention barrier is still at play almost as much as it was before the market got to this place. And so we still see, again, that wage gap being just as high and in fact increasing. We see retention being just as high and sometimes in some races higher than it was when the market was where it was today. And so the many parts of our market, many parts of our economy are still invisible to the market. And until we get to that point, we have not reached a full economy.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. I don't think we're at maximum employment for our particular population. Women who are primary breadwinners for their family, the barriers around housing or early childhood care for their kids, and so it's a choice. It's not that they couldn't get a job. It's just that job wouldn't be able to cover the expenses that they have for some of those basic needs.
Yeah, I also agree we're not at maximum employment with the Minnesota concern. So, one of the things that's been great, we've been able to hire much more diverse employees in the state of Minnesota, and the whole environment of competing with business sector to go out and get the talent wherever you can, making your workforce diverse and inclusive is just, it's a wonderful power that's there right now. I think that a lot of companies are competing with one another in a really good way. But I'm concerned, though, about Minnesota. You're looking at it from a national perspective, but I'm concerned that if we don't keep up, if we don't start providing educational and training opportunities for the folks to fill these talented positions, we're going to lose to other states who are. So there is a potential here for a Minnesota loss, which I'm concerned about because one of the things we certainly want Minnesota to continue to grow, and all the people who have businesses here to expand their business in Minnesota. So I'm looking at it somewhat parochially, a little bit different than you. But I would sacrifice a little bit of price stability for more employment, maximum employment, personally.
So I just want to thank the panel for all your great work, and especially the Federal Reserve. I'm Kelly Harder. I'm the Community Services Director in Dakota County here in Minnesota. So we oversee womb to the tomb services, welfare benefits, and others. And I would, if I was sitting next to Commissioner Frans there, I would say, though we have more jobs, right, more supply than we do demand. The work we have in our community, it's not full employment because, for example, for affordable housing in Dakota County, you have to work 88 hours minimum wage, 88 hours per household per week just to have it be affordable, not pay 30% more. Well, that's not a formula that worked. Yet we can be at full employment, got employers everywhere. Everyone's like, there's jobs, but they're not paying it's not a livable type of arrangement for it. So I was really intrigued to what the feds may continue to do. I can't say enough about all the research and what we do. My question is, well, then what? You know, we do these researches and great questions come from it, but how do we transaction it into the fact that I think our real paradox in our country is we have this healthy economy, low unemployment. From the optics from the balcony is it looks good, right? But it isn't good because we have more people in poverty, and the poverty that they're in is deeper than it's ever been. And the complexities that come with these families is more complex than it's ever been. And until we look at we look through all our work through the social determinants of health, and thriving economics is a component, but it absent stable education, transportation, housing, and healthy food options, the rest doesn't matter. And so I appreciate the fact that you have a big lever. It's called the federal lever you can pull. But what I think we can do, and we do this well in Minnesota, home of grassroots, work that we do here, is we can incubate a lot of really innovative work. And we've done this at the county level, the city level, partnering with our nonprofit partners in communities of color, indigenous communities, and we can scale that up federally. And I think that at times, and we're working right now with some federal projects where we're incubating in county and city and community, and how do we scale that out? Because I'm humbled by the size of the lever that you have to pull, but I'm concerned about the fact that we have such income disparity, and yet we're seeing our country is so successfully economically right now. And I don't know to the question, but what's the temperature? I'd love for the Federal Reserve at some point, it's like, do you have a role in doing anything about the disparity of that income when in fact interest rates are low and the economy is strong? On one hand, you're doing your job exactly as you should be doing it and you're commissioned to do it, but yet we see all these lives being adversely impacted by it. And however, what role we can play in contributing to that, I just can't say enough how much I honor that you're willing to sit here and challenge our systems with these hard questions, because you don't have to. So I commend you and your staff for that. Thank you.
Right there, I think.
Hi there. So one of the questions I have after listening to your guys' discussion, and I admit I'm asking it kind of a little worried that we haven't done a good job in kind of conveying this information, is I'm wondering what you guys have learned in terms of the Fed, not just kind of what we can do, but what we do or what we're supposed to do. What you learned maybe about monetary policy, and in particular, what you learned about what monetary policy can do, what more it can do, or what it can do better in terms of affecting a lot of the issues we've talked about in terms of the labor market inequality, and maybe what limitations you maybe realize that what monetary policy can maybe only do so much. And maybe not just monetary policy, but also financial regulation, some of the other things the Fed have done. So, the broader question is kind of, is there something you've learned about just the Fed itself and the policies the Fed are focused on that came out of this?
Well, I'll take a shot at that right away. One of the things that I was really impressed with was the degree to which we don't know a lot of stuff, that the data that you're using is hard to get, and many times you can't actually measure the thing we want to know, but you got to measure something that approximates that. So I was fairly overwhelmed with the difficulty that you all have in accessing data and good conclusions about that data, about what it means. It seemed to me like most of the research papers ended up with a few more questions than they really originally began with, and which is great, right? But I am overwhelmed with the difficulty in you all being able to say this is exactly what we know about, income volatility over the last 10 years. So to me, I have some awareness of the difficulty in getting to those conclusions.
I was reminded of what you can't do, which is important, and that the conversation between us becomes important. But when I heard that you have a role with financial institutions, and again, I'm revealing my own ignorance, it's like, wow, that's huge. I mean, your ability to impact the financial institutions in the situation where we are now, where very few of them control most of the market, is enormous. And I don't think that can be understated. For all of the talk we've had about inequality, that is a really important lever that might be more precise than the big ones that you have, and is incredibly important.
We have a question here. We're getting close to the end. This might
Let me just say
Can I-
one more thing
sorry,
first.
respond to that
Go
too.
ahead.
Yep.
You go
So this
first.
is probably the 5th time I've been asked to come speak at the Minneapolis Fed. So I'm going to answer your question a little bit differently and less about what I learned about monetary policy and what your role is, and learn that one thing I did take away is the need for you all to talk to each other. So what I watch really carefully is body language, and I watched different speakers respond to different speakers with, "That's not what I believe." I contradicted that 10 minutes ago. Weren't you listening to me an hour ago? Why didn't you pull that out of your deck? So what I would say is there's some value to community and economic leaders like us being in the room. There's also value to you all who spoke over the last day and a half, spending time with one another, spending time not only on the presentations and the data that you presented, but also spending time layering that data with racial, spatial, and place-based data and analyzing that more and thinking through when the data does contradict each other, what does that mean? Do we really have conclusions, or is this a study that leads to another study that leads to another study? And how does that then influence not only the advocacy and the lobbying that you do, but how does that influence your relationship to different communities across the country?
Well, I'll follow up with that, Tawanna. That's great, because I think I know I need help trying to explain to the public what it is I do at the state level. And I know that we need more help from you all to explain what you do in a way that the common person can understand on the street. And listen, I've been hundreds of town halls around the state of Minnesota trying to explain the Minnesota budget and what we do, and it's really hard. And it really focuses your attention on trying to make things understandable in that way. So anyway, I would encourage you to work with us to help explain this stuff so that everyone can understand it, because it's important to everyone to understand these principles. I think that's one of the reasons we see such a difference of opinion and politically, is because people aren't dealing with the same set of facts, and there are just some facts we all kind of need to know.
In lots of different dimensions, if you look at macroeconomic data, what you see are that disadvantaged groups experience a sort of high amplitude version of what relatively advantaged groups experience. So you see this, for example, in black unemployment rates compared to white unemployment rates, Hispanic unemployment rates of individuals with a high school education or less compared to college education. I'm wondering whether you can validate that from your own experience. If you look back 5 years ago compared to today, through the lenses of a macroeconomist, which my lenses are, the world looks a lot better, and we see that indeed, as Bill was saying earlier, gaps have come in. It's still the case that the African American unemployment rate is higher than the white unemployment rate, but are you seeing on the ground, as people who are on the front lines of some very difficult situations, are you seeing that there are communities that are more functional today than was the case 5 years ago? Are you seeing that there are individuals who are capable of lifting up not only themselves but those around them who wouldn't have been able to do that 5 years ago? And I ask it because one of you mentioned about touched on the idea of the sort of the urgency of this moment, because from a macroeconomic point of view, the situation is really good right now. So it'd be interesting to know whether, from your sort of very hands-on experience, is the payoff there in your experience today compared to 5 years ago?
Are we going to go right down the line? It's very interesting. You know, I think what I've seen in the last 5 years is a diminished feeling of hope. I really have, and maybe because it seems like the economy has gone better for everybody but us, you know, and so I see a diminishment of hope. I go back to housing. You know, we lose more affordable housing on a monthly basis in Minneapolis than we gain. You know, so every month there's less opportunity for a person that's working, 2 people working minimum wage, getting a 2-bedroom apartment to satisfy them and their 2 children. you know, and so I see the opportunities, although that, you know, again, you can read about it, but I just see at the base level, they're not seeing those opportunities, and that really skews their ability to strive and grab. And I'm a cheerleader, you know, and so my goal in life is to pull people up or push them up and help them up. But I know in the last 5 years I've actually seen more of a decrease in their excitement when I'm excited.
Two things stand out to me. I love the question that are really important. One is, in the aggregate, things clearly have gotten better. But what scares me about that is economic mobility, I don't think have. So even though, you know, unemployment may be shrinking, the same people are stuck in that unemployment or underemployment, whereas in the past it could have been the same level and the mobility was greater. So I'm really worried about economic mobility going down even as the overall economics go up. The other thing that we haven't talked about that's very different now from 2014 is the whole political culture we're in is in a process right now of tearing down institutions. And the Fed is, you know, so far one of the only last remaining, you know, undiminished in that. And that institutional culture, parts of it are good because we need to rebuild things, but I'm concerned that we're going after every single institution that matters in a democracy and to capitalism, and that has a huge impact on addressing the things that we need to address as a democratic, you know, capitalist country going forward.
I would echo both of the comments that were called out earlier. I also want to call out one of the economists who spoke maybe this morning, I think it was this morning, called out the fact that when the shock occurs, those who are employed are those for EITC, yes, spoke about EITC, and when the shock occurs, those who are employed, who are married and employed, experience the need to be able to benefit from that, right, more than those who are unemployed. If you put a race lens on that, and think about that, then you get the math that I'm about to go to, right? So we're talking a lot about those who are unemployed and who are at the lowest ends of the economic spectrum, and yet when we think about wealth building, African Americans who are employed, who are degreed, who are earning potential, are still behind from a wealth perspective than others in the economy. Native Americans, Latino Americans are still behind from a wealth perspective, and so even while we see the unemployment gap closing, the double impact is still there. So while it may be 4%, it may be 6%, it may be 8%, it's still double what it is for whites. And so then when we look at wealth, it's nothing, right? The number, whether it's 2,000 for this population or it's 8,000 for that population, it's nothing because it's 1 month's worth of income, right? It's gone the moment anything happens. And so really, you use the words functional. I would say people were already functional because that 13,000, was it, that you gave, Michael, people who are not in the workforce, or 40,000 who are not in the workforce, they're functional right now. They're solving for their families. They're just not using employers' dollars to do so. So they're functional. They're solving for their families today. What I would say is we see more opportunity for those communities, for those people, to be able to take advantage of opportunities of employers who now see them as the last resort to be able to come into the economy, where we need them to see them as talent, as great assets in our economy. The other piece I would say is while we spent a lot of time on workforce and human capital, the same notion exists in procurement for business development, where we have a significant number of businesses owned by communities of color that play a huge role in our economy at growing it, who grow it faster than any other portion of our economy, and who are more likely to hire people of color at faster rates and at livable wages, to the point that you raised earlier. We also don't see those numbers growing at the rates that we'd like to see them and should see them when businesses take advantage of contracting with those businesses in order to grow the economy. So they're there. They're taking advantage of those opportunities clearly as we see the gap closing in employment, but not at rates fast enough to close the wealth gap and actually grow the economy and stabilize poverty.
I would echo everything that's been said and simply say that in the last 5 years, I do think that there has been a growing, back to the notion of despair, a growing anxiety among the population that we serve in terms of how are they going to keep up and or continue to advance in order to provide for their families, right? And so the degree of anxiety and mental health related issues, I think, have increased for our population in the last 5 years than we had seen before, because there's that vulnerability, that increased vulnerability that they're feeling.
let me just say from the state perspective, I agree with your first assessment. From the state of Minnesota, in terms of the economy and the budget that we're saying, you know, we've been able to, since 2013, we increased the income taxes, and we added a fourth income tax tier, made taxes more progressive. And since then, we've had surplus after surplus. We've been able to do some good things in terms of state pension reform. We've gotten our AAA credit rating back. We've been able to bond for a lot of good capital projects. But I think that Michael and Sean and Tawanna and Gloria tell us that there's still another story there. And I know that the Governor Walz that I work for now is very concerned about the stories and that we don't leave people behind. And I think there's a really important sense that we cannot accept this stability, this financial or budget stability that we're experiencing as reason to just set back. We have to engage even more to let everybody participate in this good economy.
Thanks for great questions. Thank you, panel.